Merci Jean-Bernard. Pour être tout à fait honnête, ça n'est pas très facile d'intervenir juste après Barbara Hendricks. Alors heureusement, il y a eu la pause qui a permis à chacun de reprendre ses esprits. Mais c'est vrai que ce qu'elle nous a dit sur l'art avait plutôt nous a permis d'élever nos âmes. Et évidemment, la question que vous me posez, Jean-Bernard, nous amènera à être un petit peu plus terre à terre. J'essaierai de ne pas tomber trop bas, mais ça n'est pas très facile. Avant toute chose, je voudrais dire que moi, j'ai trouvé le débat que nous avons eu tout à l'heure extrêmement intéressant et stimulant. Et surtout, j'ai trouvé qu'il était bon de parler de culture, d'investissement et d'investissement dans la culture en ces temps d'inquiétude économique. Et c'est précisément dans ces périodes de crise et d'inquiétude qu'il est important de s'interroger sur ce que sont nos atouts, sur la manière de les valoriser et de les développer. Et c'est effectivement l'une des missions de la Caisse des dépôts. Alors pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas la Caisse des dépôts, cette institution est une grande banque d'investissement public. Elle intervient évidemment beaucoup, vous pouvez l'imaginer, en ce moment dans le domaine industriel et dans le domaine des secteurs financiers. Mais c'est également un acteur important de l'investissement dans le secteur de la culture, dans tous les domaines, le cinéma avec des projets comme la Cité du cinéma de Luc Besson, la musique avec le Théâtre des Champs-Élysées que nous venons de rénover en profondeur, et puis toute une série d'événements musicaux partout sur le territoire, depuis les Corrigis d'Orange ou le festival du hip-hop à Bron. Richard David a fait référence au hip-hop tout à l'heure. C'est une des activités que nous soutenons. Alors, ce qui est important, et c'est un petit peu la question que vous posez, c'est de bien comprendre quel est le modèle économique de l'investissement dans la culture pour une grande institution comme la nôtre. Et je crois que ce modèle économique, il repose sur deux principes. Le premier, c'est que la culture est un bon investissement de long terme. C'est un bon investissement parce que c'est un investissement qui produit des effets sur le long terme, parfois sur le très long terme, mais des effets qui durent et qui durent longtemps. Et puis, c'est un investissement qui produit des effets qui se diffusent à l'ensemble de la société, ce que nos amis anglo-saxons appelleraient les spillover effects. Donc ça, c'est une bonne raison d'investir dans ce domaine-là. Et puis, le deuxième principe, c'est que pour rester dans une logique d'investissement avisé, d'investisseur avisé, eh bien, il faut mutualiser, il faut avoir une approche mutualisée des investissements dans la culture, parce qu'on sait bien que tous les investissements dans la culture ne sont pas immédiatement rentables et ne sont pas tous rentables au même niveau. Donc, c'est ça qui nous conduit, nous, Caisse des dépôts, à accompagner des investissements dans le patrimoine culturel. Nous avons créé un fonds qui s'appelle Patrimoine et Création, qui vise à développer ce patrimoine et de les accompagner d'autres investissements dans des activités plus immédiatement rentables, plus immédiatement porteuses de développement, notamment dans le secteur du numérique, parce que le numérique et les nouvelles technologies en général permettent de réconcilier économie et culture et sont vraiment un facteur de convergence très fort entre ces deux domaines.
Merci Antoine. Je crois qu'on est heureux de vous entendre dire que malgré difficultés aujourd'hui en matière de gestion des finances publiques et privées, il y a un investisseur dans le secteur financier qui a compris l'importance à long terme de ces investissements culturels et leur intérêt collectif. Chaque année, le Forum d'Avignon s'appuie sur des études qu'il fait réaliser pour l'occasion, et c'est justement le thème de l'étude que Vincent Fausti et Charles Landry vont nous présenter. Donc je les invite à nous rejoindre. Finalement, dans votre étude, vous étudiez justement la façon dont la mondialisation interfère avec l'investissement culturel. Et vous allez nous décrire quels sont les arguments qui vous semblent les plus convaincants pour que les acteurs publics et privés continuent à investir dans la culture. C'est à vous.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is this moving? It is. It is moving. It is moving more. I've got to try and... there. Yes, this is going to be a ding-dong between Vincent and me. I will say something, he will say something, and we'll go back and forward like a game of table tennis here, if that's okay. So I looked at really the connection between creativity, the city, and culture. And I think we all know about the dramatic transformations in the world. And at its simplest, it's quite clear, and again, this is not working, it's quite clear that the world, in one sense or another, has become a smaller place. And in that context, we all know, of course, that there's the intense local culture, global culture question that is framing everything we do. And of course, therefore, as someone already said this earlier today, this is really, culture has become even more part of the DNA of everything we do. Now, for some people, this process, of course, is very invigorating. And for others, it's extremely, let's say, frightening in some way or another. And given this dilemma of invigorating and frightening, the role of culture and thinking deeply is really absolutely essential. Every city in the world, and this is from Shanghai, where the expo, whose theme was Better Cities, Better Life, is thinking about its role, purpose in life. And one of the main issues that emerged from that, if I simplify a vast event in 2 sentences, was that culture needs to move center stage again. And this was very interesting, since it also included the Chinese mayors, the Chinese cities, and all those Asian cities who are developing at a vast speed. And many people are asking and saying, how can we have an ideal again, some sort of view, a bigger view of the world? And that bigger view includes the idea of obviously being creative, because reinventing and making cities, of course, is an act of creation. Now, every city is trying to be a magnet in some sense, but looking at the cultural perspective, of course, it is a primordial force. And the key question I ask from this event here is to switch the question: what is the value of investing in culture, design, art, heritage, green thinking, soft thinking? That's not the question I think we should be asking. The question we should be asking is really, what is the cost of not thinking about culture, art, design, heritage, green, ecological thinking, and so on? And that, to me, is the central issue. So, of course, we want a lot of artists. We want a hell of a lot of them, of course. They are one incredibly important expression of the cultural domain. But we also want, art that is extremely interesting and challenging and provocative. So now over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Well, we start with the same fundamental beliefs and observation, rise in cultural activity, development of creative industries. But our prime focus was on the investment decision-making. Which projects, which criteria to use to select them and evaluate them. We looked at the decision-maker himself, the cultural entrepreneur, as we call him now, and how he or she needs to combine new sets of skills. In particular, as culture goes digital, we addressed that this morning. In doing so, we did not really oppose the public sector and the private sector, but rather promoted the idea that they should work together. We also looked at a number of projects and undertakings worldwide, about 50 of them. And although it's a fairly recent phenomenon, we've seen cultural projects being considered with the same tools, the same processes, and the same approaches as non-cultural investments at large. The governance expectations are more demanding on cultural investors. Rating agencies are looking at cultural projects and the cultural footprint organizations leave behind. But if, of course, even in the best practice examples that we've seen, shall never substitute for the talent, the passion, the intuition that triggered in the projects in the first place. So this was our attempt to frame the similarities and the differences between cultural investments and non-cultural investments, to try to derive most learnings from that. But Charles, I know you've taken a look at that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key issue is really the difference when you link culture, creativity, and the city together, is really the difference between the urban engineering approach to city making, which is purely hardware driven, that thinks of roads and cement and loves the endlessness of asphalt, versus the sensory experience of cities, which it is a sensory emotional experience with psychological effects. And although hardware is quite important at some level, it's not the totality of life. And of course, sometimes that narrow, what I'm calling the engineering approach, can sometimes be a bit limited and insensitive, this is Italy, in the way it goes about things in the world. But of course, engineering is a wonderful discipline. Things need to work, of course they do. That's absolutely true. But we need to have this other layer. And you can see all over the world, this is Chicago's Millennium Park, and you know the types of transformations that are happening everywhere. And here is just an example, which you probably all know, from a car park to something that is a rich, multi-layered experience, which obviously is good for every type of person who you might find in a city. Because in the end, what is a city? A city is a place of meeting, transacting, exchange, and so on. So everything that one needs to do within a city is to encourage and really reinvent the art of conviviality, because through conviviality and, in a sense, living together, speaking, communicating together, that's how, of course, culture evolves, is renegotiated, and changes over time. So many of these things are, of course, intangible. Many accountants in the world find this all a bit difficult because they want the proof, when many of the soft qualitative things are difficult to measure. But anyway, when you think about all of this together, really this shift from creative to creative city making that blends hard and software thinking versus urban engineering, you can see that this is a paradigm shift. Now, one of the issues people have asked, I think, and you've asked, Jean-Bernard, is what is the best cultural policy? And I would just simplify. I think the best cultural policy I've seen, easy words to say, by the way, is fivefold. Ones that help us link to enlightenment in some sense, give us some insight, some breakthrough. Secondly, in some sense, that also lift our spirits in one way, empower us. So enlightenment, empowerment is perhaps the second key word that one should think of. And thirdly, of course, there is the issue of entertainment and fun in some sort of way. That, of course, perhaps is a third dimension. The fourth dimension, they all begin with E, enlightenment, empowerment, entertainment. Employability is perhaps a fourth dimension, which is the confidence creation that culture creates, and fifthly, economic impact.
My keywords don't start with an E. We looked at
that's a pity.
About 50 projects through the study. The first word will be open, and that will be open to partnerships, in particular between the public and the private sectors. Looking, of course, for funding, but also for competencies and skills that you would find in one or the other area. Sustainable. And that is to say long-term, in a way that survives the creators. And often with projects we've seen a lack of consideration for succession planning beyond the creators and beyond the projects or beyond the decision makers themselves. Creative, of course, it goes without saying, but still it is essential in a project we'll see. Transparent, very critical, especially as new forms of investors are looking at these projects. And as possibly cultural goods and services will be charged for being less transparent, as perceived as more intangible, as you mentioned earlier. And eventually measurable return. And in your area, Charles, in the city world, I'm sure you've seen the recent report that basically was saying that an increase in 10% in cultural spending would trigger an increase of GDP per inhabitant of about 1.7%. Is that something that you've observed in your analysis as well?
Basically, as we know, most places in the world are transforming to more from industrial areas to more knowledge-intensive areas. And in my study, I looked at 6 European cities. And all I can say is, of course, all of them have used culture in one way or another, particularly, and I'm just going to show you old buildings as one example. Because why that's interesting, this is Liverpool here, is simply because the patina of ages often is the thing that inspires the new. Jane Jacobs said, to have new ideas, you need old buildings. And of course, you can sometimes do it in new buildings, but it's a bit more difficult, I can assure you. So Liverpool was one of our case studies. You can see them trying to do it. This is in Lille, an old textile factory, which now houses Ancana, one of the biggest games companies in France and so on. And this is, of course, very near something called Le Frenoir, which is a performance area and so on. So you can see the way that culture is increasingly embedded into the economy in a much more subtle and sophisticated way. And there are new forms of working which are less that hierarchical, top-down, big types of companies. Here is the Ruhr area, which is very famous, Hampshire Park initiative that completely transformed old structures into new structures and created some sort of bigger resonance to sort of show the transformation that they've undertaken. So these things are happening really all around the world, and this is where the next forum is going to take place, I hope. But they also did one thing interestingly in the Ruhr, where they closed a motorway for 60 kilometers for one day, and 2 million people came. And that again is sort of the culture of recapturing space and the public realm in one way or another. So that's, of course, happened, the famous Bilbao effect, which is another of the case studies, and even Bologna. Bologna had less of it, needed less to regenerate because it is a knowledge-intensive city. But even there, they're playing with all of these things as well. So anyway, over to you.
I said I shouldn't have looked at the cartoons for at least 10 minutes. Well, I know you and I have met it before. I know your enthusiasm about cities and the spillover effect of culture into cities. I believe there's still a bit of a distance to walk between that and considering culture as almost as an anti-crisis weapon. Through economic terms, culture has grown. Through creative industries are developing. I do believe, though, they're not immune from a financing standpoint from the current conditions. We've seen public spending actually, shrunk down. Patrons and donors and corporations are reducing their spending in the sector. The one thing we'd seen though is demand is strong. So in all industries in the world, if demand is strong, then possibly we have a future economy. It is a source of encouragement when most of the signals are red, indeed. But again, considering the various projects we've seen, be cautious with considering that as the new single recipe for crisis.
So what does a Vivendi do? Well, I think a Vivendi, or someone like you, I think that you're part, these private companies here, are part of a broader creative ecology. And you, to some extent, need all the vibrancy and creativity that stems from the sort of people that perhaps live within the artistic core. But the overall aim, I think, is usually to try to create conditions where ordinary people can make the extraordinary happen if given a chance. And ultimately, a creative place is a place which allows people to think, plan, and act with imagination, is what I think.
Well, I think for a company like Vivendi or any large organization, culture now really becomes part of not only sustainable development, I've mentioned it earlier, the social balance sheet is the term, well beyond financial return. So I think, several companies, at least corporations, have included that in their balanced scorecards. They're assessing their own cultural footprint on the areas where they do operate, potentially globally for some of them, so in a balanced fashion. As a matter of fact, actually, Vivendi, I believe, has introduced the cultural footprint as part of their executive packages and executive corporate scorecards and compensation. Jean-Bernard, maybe you want to give us just a brief word of explanation why you did that. I'm sure you'll do that much better than myself, and while we'll be standing on that dog.
I think it's a
Pardon, il faut que je vous parle en français. Je dirais que ça s'explique de soi-même, self-explanatory. Nous avons en effet décidé chez Vivendi depuis maintenant 2 ans que dans tous les objectifs annuels de tous les dirigeants d'un certain niveau du groupe, nous aurions des objectifs que nous appelons de développement durable, des objectifs sociétaux, de telle sorte que nous ne travaillons pas uniquement sur des objectifs à vocation purement comptable, économique, et que nous mesurions bien, selon des moyens qui sont assez souples et assez larges, la place de l'investissement sociétal, de l'imprégnation sociétale de nos travaux, que ce soit nos investissements, que ce soit en matière d'infrastructures, de plateformes, ou bien évidemment dans les talents créatifs que ceci prend dans notre organisation. En tout cas, je vous remercie beaucoup de votre intervention. Je crois qu'avoir l'œil de l'urbaniste a été quelque chose qui est extrêmement utile et que vous nous avez rappelé un certain nombre de vérités, avec en plus un slideshow qui était très, très intéressant, qui nous a presque fait faire un tour du monde en quelques minutes et qui va se relier parfaitement à la suite de nos travaux. Non seulement parce que nous aurons en fin de session quelques mots du préfet Canepa, qui lui-même est en plein dans la réurbanisation, le nouveau grand projet du Grand Paris, et qui nous expliquera le rôle que la culture peut y jouer. Et parce que nous allons maintenant, et je les invite à venir s'installer ici même, nous allons maintenant avoir un autre économiste, David Throsby, qui nous vient d'Australie. Nous aurons Jochen Gertz et nous aurons Siem Belkodja, qui chacun avec un œil différent vont venir nous éclairer sur leur propre vision. Donc je vous invite tous les trois, si vous le voulez bien, à nous rejoindre. Et on va donc commencer avec David Throsby, qui est économiste et professeur à l'université de Macquarie à Sydney. D'autres économistes brillants sont dans la salle, notamment Christian de Boissieu, qui est le président du Conseil d'analyse économique auprès du Premier ministre du gouvernement français. Et je suis sûr que la façon dont David vous a élaboré vos réflexions sur le rôle des financements dans la culture, est-ce que ça doit être considéré comme un coût, comme un investissement? Quels sont les facteurs qui aident les différents pays en matière de créativité artistique? Pourquoi certains pays en bonne santé et aussi certains pays en difficulté aident ou arrête d'aider l'investissement dans le domaine de la culture? Nous vous écoutons sur ces thèmes. À vous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it's true that countries vary in the way in which they invest in culture, but I think the important question that we have to consider, and I'm saying this from the point of view of being an economist, is how do economists regard culture, and how can we talk to economists about culture in a way which they will understand and comprehend? I think that Antoine said earlier today that culture is an asset, and I think the way in which we should understand culture is as an asset. And in fact, we have a relatively new concept in the economics of art and culture, which is that of cultural capital, which is capital assets which have both cultural value and economic value. And I think then we can see, if that's the case, that expenditure on culture is an investment. It's an investment in maintaining existing cultural assets, or it's an investment in creating new cultural assets. And then we can go on from that, if we're economists, to evaluate these using the methods of economic analysis. I'd just like to give you some examples of the sorts of ways in which culture can be seen, expenditure on culture can be seen as an investment, and the way in which it can have an economic payoff. I have 5 examples. The first, taken from my own country, Australia. there's a dance company called Bangara, which is an indigenous dance company, and it creates work from the traditional stories of the Aboriginal people and reworks them as contemporary dance with contemporary music. And investing in this sort of work is risky. It's a cost, and you don't know what the payoff is going to be. It's like research and development expenditure in science and technology and industry. It's exactly the same in culture. But the payoff for the company like Bangara